Plato didn't write about romance the way modern thinkers do. He wasn't interested in flattery or fantasy. He was interested in truth. And one of the most uncomfortable truths he hinted at, especially in texts like the Symposium and the Republic, is that most people, especially those bound by social roles, struggle to love what they cannot control. That includes women. That includes men. But in his time, and even now, Plato believed this applied sharply to women in particular when facing a man who could not be tamed. He described love not as a transaction or emotional dependency, but as something divine. A bridge to higher understanding, a force that pulls us toward what is eternal and free. But when love becomes possession, it degrades. It shifts from admiration to control, from connection to dependence, from reverence to need. And Plato understood this. Most people don't fall in love with freedom. They fall in love with certainty, routine, and power over vulnerability. Real freedom threatens the illusion of safety. It demands that we relinquish control. And most people, regardless of time period, aren't ready for that. If this idea already stings, if you're tired of losing yourself in relationships where you can't breathe, subscribe now. Because this isn't about gender politics. It's about philosophical survival. It's about waking up from roles that have kept you stuck, dependent, or unseen. What Plato's talking about isn't just ancient theory, it's a mirror. Plato's concern wasn't with women as individuals. It was with the culture that conditioned them to desire security above truth, predictability above depth. In a world that rewarded obedience, the average woman was not raised to admire freedom in a man. She was raised to feel threatened by it. A man who doesn't bend, who can walk away, who chooses solitude over validation. That man is hard to love, and if you've been trained to see love as mutual submission. And many men, craving peace more than truth, play along. They shrink themselves to stay loved. But Plato challenges that compromise, because he knew love without freedom is dependence. And dependence, no matter how affectionate, is built on fear. A man who refuses to be reshaped, who speaks with clarity instead of compromise, who sees love as a meeting of souls, not an exchange of power. That man will always seem dangerous to someone who equates love with safety. And that's where the fracture begins. Because freedom feels like abandonment to someone who hasn't cultivated inner security. To love a free man, you must also be free. You must love without needing to control, admire without needing to possess, support without needing to shrink him. And Plato knew that was rare. It still is. A truly free man is a threat, not because he wants to dominate, but because he refuses to be dominated. Plato understood that in every society, there are systems designed to tame that kind of man. Some are political, some are economic, but many are relational. They operate quietly through emotion, guilt, and expectation. When a man is truly independent, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, he becomes immune to the usual rewards. He can't be bribed with flattery. He doesn't bend for approval. He doesn't crave validation. That's not arrogance. That's clarity. And for someone who's been taught that love means emotional access, that kind of clarity is unbearable. In Plato's view, most relationships aren't built on mutual growth. They're built on silent contracts, unspoken agreements where each person promises to be what the other needs, even at the cost of truth. The free man breaks that contract. He won't perform. He won't lie. And the moment he stops playing the role, he becomes difficult to love. For those who only know how to love control. That's why Plato's philosophy still cuts deep, because it forces the question, do you love the person, or do you love what they give you? Do you admire their freedom? Or do you quietly wish they'd tone it down to make you feel safer? Most can't answer that honestly. And that's exactly the problem. The free man, Plato's ideal, was not concerned with being understood. He was concerned with living in alignment with truth. That made him dangerous, not because he was violent or cruel, but because he didn't need approval. He could walk away from comfort. He could say no without guilt. He could choose solitude over attachment if the attachment came with strings. And that kind of man unsettles anyone still living by scripts they never wrote. Why does that matter? Because most relationships aren't built on truth. They're built on compromise. Not the kind of compromise that comes from mutual respect, but the kind that comes from quiet fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being rejected, fear of not being enough. Plato warned that when love is built on fear, it collapses the moment someone stops performing. And the free man refuses to perform. He won't play the role of emotional caretaker. He won't shrink his purpose to soothe insecurity. He won't become a version of himself just to keep the peace. And this is where things break. Because many people, especially those taught to seek security above all else, don't know how to love someone they can't predict. So what happens next? They label him cold, selfish, emotionally unavailable. Not because he lacks love, but because he refuses to be ruled by fear. That's not dysfunction. That's what Plato saw as rare strength. A man devoted not to pleasing others, but to becoming whole. What happens when a woman meets a man she can't control, but also can't dismiss? Plato would say she's being confronted by something far deeper than attraction. She's facing her own philosophical edge. A man who doesn't conform, who doesn't perform for approval, forces her to confront her own relationship with freedom. Not his, Heron. Because to truly love a free man is to let go of the need to define him, to pin him down, to mold him into someone safer. That means no constant emotional testing, no silent punishments when he chooses solitude, no manipulation disguised as affection. It means meeting him as an equal, not as a project, not as a prize. Plato saw love as a gateway to higher truth. But truth isn't always pleasant. It's not soft. It's raw. And when a man holds to his truth without folding, when he refuses to betray himself just to keep the peace, he becomes unbearable to someone still addicted to control. He becomes the one thing modern relationships secretly fear: ungovernable. That's the paradox. Women who crave strength are often drawn to these men. But once inside the relationship, the same strength they admired becomes a threat. Why? Because true strength doesn't obey. It doesn't chase. And if love was taught as sacrifice or submission, that kind of strength looks like distance, not depth. Plato didn't romanticize love. He stripped it down to its essence, the tension between desire and transcendence. And unless both people have done the work to free themselves internally, love becomes a game of pressure, not presence. Freedom in a man is not loud. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't perform. It simply refuses to bend. That's what makes it so hard to understand and so easy to resent. Plato knew that a free man threatens any relationship built on unconscious expectation. Because he doesn't play roles. He doesn't conform just to be liked. He speaks when truth demands it. He disappears when peace requires it. He acts on principle, not pressure. And that, to many, feels dangerous. Freedom creates space. Space where most people are used to closeness. And that space, for someone who equates love with possession, can feel like rejection. Plato understood this tension. He saw that real love is admiration for the soul's freedom, not a contract for emotional obedience. But few are raised to see it that way. They're taught to love comfort, not character. Predictability, not presence. But here's the paradox. The same qualities that make a free man magnetic, his clarity, his independence, his refusal to chase, are the same qualities that often drive people away. Especially those who equate love with closeness, control, or constant affirmation. Plato's philosophy wasn't that women were incapable of deep love. It was that society hadn't prepared them for it. They were taught to value reliability over depth, sacrifice over sovereignty. And a man who refuses to be domesticated doesn't fit into that equation. That's why so many women fall for the image of the free man, but try to change the reality. They admire the strength, but want to soften it. They love the solitude, but want to fill it. They praise his self-sufficiency, but slowly resent it. Not because they're manipulative, but because they've been taught that true intimacy requires merging, not mirroring. They expect surrender, not mutual respect. They crave presence, but fear the independence that comes with it. A free man forces you to confront yourself. He holds up a mirror you can't shatter. His detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's a refusal to lose himself just to make you feel more secure. And for someone who sees love as emotional fusion, that boundary feels like distance. But it isn't. It's where real respect begins. And Plato would argue, that's not love. That's dependency dressed as devotion. It feels romantic, but it's a transaction, a trade of selfhood for validation, and it cannot survive the presence of someone who doesn't need to be completed, because he's already whole. And that's exactly what makes him so hard to keep, and even harder to forget. The truth is, most people don't want to love. They want to merge. They want to dissolve into someone else so completely that they never have to face their own emptiness. Plato would call this a corruption of love. Because when love becomes a strategy for self-erasure, it's no longer about truth. It's about escape. A free man, one who knows himself, who can walk alone, who doesn't need to be needed, exposes that dysfunction. He doesn't offer rescue. He doesn't make his love a leash. And for someone who hasn't yet made peace with their own soul, that kind of man is unbearable. Plato believed that the highest form of love, the one that elevates the soul, only happens between two people who are whole. Not perfect, not complete, but grounded. A woman who is at war with herself will turn her man into a shield, a therapist, a father figure, anything but what he actually is. And a man who doesn't know himself will play along, thinking he's being noble, not realizing he's losing himself in the process. Real love, in Plato's view, is an ascent, a movement toward something higher, not a descent into mutual dependency. But that requires something rare. Two people who can stand alone before they stand together. Without that, the relationship becomes a quiet war, a war of silent expectations, of unspoken demands, of slowly tightening control. And the freer one person becomes, the more the other resents it. Until what once looked like love becomes something else entirely. A fight for power disguised as connection. Most men don't realize how rare their freedom is until it starts to cost them something. And one of the first places it costs them is love. Not all women reject a free man, but many feel unconsciously threatened by him. He doesn't chase, he doesn't explain, he doesn't bend to emotional strategy. That kind of man doesn't play by the rules they were taught to expect, and that makes him dangerous. Plato would argue that this isn't cruelty, it's integrity. A free man lives by principles, not by approval. He's not seeking peace at any cost, he's seeking truth even if it causes discomfort. And for someone raised to equate love with harmony, that feels like rejection. But it's not. It's just that the free man doesn't play along with expectations built on control. The problem is subtle. Women conditioned to equate love with emotional closeness can unconsciously test that closeness through control, through guilt, silence, pressure, or praise. It's not always malicious. It's often unconscious. But it still works. On the man who hasn't made peace with solitude. That's where most men collapse. They trade freedom for closeness. They compromise in the name of connection. And then they wake up years later, wondering why they feel empty in a relationship they built on shrinking. Plato's warning was not about avoiding women. It was about refusing to forget who you are in their presence. Because once you do, you're no longer free. You're just agreeable. And agreeable men don't inspire respect. They inspire control. Here's the paradox Plato forces us to confront. The freer a man becomes, the harder it is for him to be loved in conventional ways. Because true freedom doesn't cater. It doesn't shape-shift to meet expectations. It stands alone, rooted in its own values, even at the cost of being misunderstood or unloved. And for many people, especially those conditioned to equate love with emotional access, this kind of man is unsettling. Most people don't want a sovereign partner. They want emotional obedience, subtle compliance, predictable vulnerability. And when they meet someone who isn't willing to offer that, they call him cold, arrogant, unavailable. But Plato saw it differently. He believed the highest form of love isn't dependency, it's recognition. To love someone is not to own them or soften them or mold them into something safer. It's to see them clearly and still choose reverence over control. This is why many people fail to love the truly free. Because freedom doesn't apologize, it doesn't explain, it doesn't beg for understanding. It simply is. And unless a person has done the inner work to respect that, they will try to reduce it. First with affection, then with guilt, and finally with withdrawal. The moment you demand that someone make themselves smaller so you can feel secure, love has already turned into fear. And Plato, through all his writings, taught one brutal truth. Fear-based love is not love. It's bondage dressed in intimacy. It's desire twisted by insecurity. To love a free man, one must let go of emotional ownership. And for many, that is too high a price. Most men today are never taught what Plato understood over 2,000 years ago. That the highest form of love is not obedience, not flattery, not constant availability. It's freedom. But freedom terrifies those who equate love with control. That's why a free man is often punished, not praised, misunderstood, not embraced. He doesn't ask for permission to be himself. He doesn't need constant reassurance. He doesn't make himself small to protect someone else's insecurity. And because of that, he becomes a threat. Not because he's cruel, but because he refuses to play a role. He won't be the emotional crutch. He won't be the savior. And he definitely won't be the prisoner. Plato believed that most people are drawn to illusions. They love what reflects their needs, not what challenges them to grow. But real love, philosophical love, is a mirror and a fire. It reflects truth and it burns away falsehood. And to stand in that kind of love takes a level of maturity most are never taught to seek. So what happens when a woman meets a man like this? One who doesn't chase, who doesn't flatter, who doesn't break himself to be loved? At first, it feels powerful, addictive. But soon, the fear creeps in. Because if she hasn't done her own work, if she hasn't made peace with her own freedom, she will start to resent his. She'll try to mold him, tame him, or leave him. Not because he failed, but because he stayed himself. And that's the paradox. The man who is hardest to possess is the one most capable of real love, but only for someone who understands that loving a free man means loving from her own freedom, not from fear, not from need, but from strength. The truth Plato pointed to isn't just about love. It's about freedom, and how rare it is to truly honor it in someone else. Most relationships collapse not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of inner wholeness. People enter relationships looking to complete themselves, to fill a void, to silence the fear of being alone. But a free man cannot play that role. He won't be your project. He won't be your mirror. He won't trade his purpose for your comfort. And so the tragedy unfolds. Many women unconsciously try to domesticate what was never meant to be tamed. Not out of malice, but out of conditioning. Society told them that a man who stays close is good, and a man who stands alone is dangerous. That dependency is intimacy, that control is security. But Plato warned, true love can only exist between equals, and equality doesn't mean sameness. It means two people who are whole on their own, who choose each other without fear, without control, without ownership. To love a free man is to love without holding, to support without reshaping, to admire without needing to be needed. That's not easy. That's not romantic fantasy. That's work. Inner work. And most people won't do it. They'll settle for control, for dependency, for routine, and call it love. But a man who has met his own soul, who has risen above approval, who refuses to be reduced, he will never stay where he's not seen clearly. He'd rather walk alone than be held by someone who fears his freedom more than they love his truth. Plato understood that kind of man. He didn't pity him, he respected him. Because in a world obsessed with possession, he chose something harder: to remain untamed, to remain true. And only a love that values freedom over comfort can reach him and hold him without breaking him. That's not the kind of love most people are ready for, but it's the only kind worth waiting for.